no game is made in a vacuum. Ocarina of Time stands on the shoulders of giants. Oh, I swear these hot takes are gonna get me killed. Zelda 2. A game with a few die-hard fans and many detractors. Its difficulty is infamous. It's known for its harsh punishment for failure and very unforgiving enemies and bosses. It gives credence to the term Nintendo hard. Few Zelda fans count this title among their favorites. Despite its lack of appreciation, the game is monumentally important to the development of the Zelda franchise. If Link to the Past set the stage for the overall feel and motif of a Zelda game, and Link's Awakening defined the item and dungeon formula, then the adventure of Link defined Zelda's combat mechanics for the 3D realm. It had a strong emphasis on swordplay, maneuvering around the enemy's movement to hit where they weren't blocking. It was a good idea on paper, but the execution on the NES left a lot to be desired. If it weren't for Zelda 2, A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, and, surprisingly, Super Mario 64, Zelda's first foray into the 3D space could have looked a lot different. No game is made in a vacuum. So how exactly did these past 2D games influence Ocarina of Time? To answer that, you'll have to grab your Furby and slap on your slap bracelet. Things are about to get weird between friends as we get jiggy with it. So hit me baby one more time, I am not gonna wait for my life to be over. It is 1998, the year the Earth got hit with 2 asteroid movies. As Mario 64 came to a close, development on the first 3D title for the Legend of Zelda series ramped up. It began with 2 developers at first, Toru Osawa, who would end up becoming the script director and the main director overseeing the project, and Jin Ikeda, who was working on character design. Yoshiaki Koizumi would join as a 3rd member of the development team, becoming the director of 3D systems and character design. All said and done, the game would have a total of 5 directors. Miyamoto would act as a producer/supervisor as he was now running the entire Nintendo EAD department, Entertainment and Analysis Division, formerly Nintendo R&D 4. It was rebranded in the early 90s. Super Mario 64 would be the last game he personally directed. In this role, Miyamoto would get a reputation throughout Nintendo for upending the tea table. He would come into development, see what the team was working on, come up with an idea, tell the team to get it done, and then leave.
What?
And since game design is anything but simple, sometimes even the simplest of changes can have far-reaching consequences. Thus, upending the tea table. From his experience in Mario 64, Miyamoto was concerned about the N64's ability to render large fields and spaces that would make up Hyrule. His starting idea was to copy Mario 64, just set the game in Ganon's castle, and then that would act as a hub to go to other sections and areas. The team assured him, though, that a wide-open world was possible on the Nintendo 64 hardware. They'd be able to bring a version of the land of Hyrule as it was known in 2D to life in 3D. And this gave Miyamoto another idea. Make Zelda 64 a first-person perspective game. You'd only see Link when the player entered combat. The perspective would shift to a side view for the battle. This would do a few things. One, it would give the player an up-close and personal view of the wide-open landscapes they were designing, and it would enable more details and polygons to be rendered in the game without having to waste any of them on the player character. Polygons were a very limited resource in these early 3D gaming consoles. The team did not like that idea, Koizumi particularly. He worked so hard on designing Link he couldn't bear to not see his hard work on screen all the time. And when they tested this idea, the first-person perspective just didn't feel right. It was promptly abandoned, though an element of it remained for aiming and looking around for clues to solve puzzles. In past games, Link was considered to be a 12-year-old boy. The Link that was designed for Ocarina of Time was an adult. A year and a half into production, with just 1 year to go till release, Miyamoto had another idea. Since you were going to see Link, he wanted to see the differences in design between adult Link and child Link. This caused a problem. All the animations for Link were motion captured and designed for adult Link. Yes, they used mocap for this back in 1998. Creating a child version of Link would mean a whole new set of animations would need to be created. Koizumi's work just doubled. Thankfully, he figured out a way to make this feasible. He took the already completed animation sets and was able to scale them down to child Link. Miyamoto liked both so much, he wanted both Links to be in the game. Thus, the time travel element was also added.
Oh my god!
A tangential aside. One of the complaints I've seen from retrospectives of this game is how it really didn't take full advantage of this time travel idea. Once you become adult Link, you really only need to go back in time a couple of times to get the Lens of Truth and to complete half of the Spirit Temple. And those events don't really change or affect the world of adult Link. They're just things done in the past. And there is one thing that you gotta do in the past that you can only get in the future to then go do in the past, but it doesn't change anything in the future. Since this mechanic was introduced so late into the game, it makes sense why more wasn't done with this idea, even though it would have been great if it had. As production continued, almost the entirety of Nintendo EAD was working on the project. Eiji Aonuma had joined Nintendo just a few years earlier and had wormed his way onto the team as one of its 5 directors. By the time he had joined, most of Osawa's script was pretty well established, and the team was rapidly turning out content. Aonuma would design 6 of the dungeons, most of the enemy characters, their battle mechanics, and would work on boss battles. He also helped with drawing storyboards. While there were titles and roles, no one really remained in their lane. If there's something that needed to be done, they just go and do it. The team worked tirelessly and enthusiastically. It wasn't until the final stretch of the development cycle did everything begin to coalesce. These random things that everyone was working on finally came together in the classic we know and love today. But if it wasn't for the 4 2D Zeldas that came before it, this game I don't think would be the beloved and transformative game it is. Because no game is made in a vacuum. Development on the first 3D Zelda game actually began during the Super Nintendo days. Miyamoto was very impressed with Star Fox's Super FX chip and wanted to create a Zelda game with that tech. The idea was to develop a polygonal Zelda 2 remake for the Super Nintendo. The idea was immediately scrapped. Production resources were reallocated to create content for the upcoming Nintendo 64. When production restarted for Zelda 64, the Zelda 2 remake idea was briefly brought back to life, and then immediately scrapped again. But that core combat idea from Zelda 2 would remain a heavy influence. The team wanted to create a Chanbara sword action game, but there were a few issues. Zelda 2's combat was, I'd argue, not great. Add the third dimension, well, that's just another complication. Translating something that some would argue didn't work well in 2D into 3D was going to be a tall order. Thankfully, Koizumi had experience on Mario 64 and understood the trouble that the third dimension can bring. Trying to do something as simple as lining Mario up with a sign for him to read wasn't as straightforward as you would think. How is combat going to work if the player couldn't even easily line themselves up to read a stationary sign? This led to the idea of Z-targeting, which was revolutionary at the time. Instead of tasking the player with keeping track of an enemy, the game would do it for you. This would solve the problem of lining up against other objects in 3D space, a problem Mario 64 never solved. But they didn't really know how they would execute on this. They needed inspiration. So the team planned a field trip to Toy Kyoto Studio Park. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think I am. Oh well. Think of an entire theme park that is pretty much the Indiana Jones stunt show at Walt Disney World, but with samurais and ninjas. The day they went was an oppressively hot day. So to escape the heat, the team ducked into a playhouse. Here, during this show, Osawa and Koizumi would each take away something different that would be indispensable to Ocarina's combat design. While watching the sword fights, Koizumi noticed that the hero would be outnumbered, but he would still win the battle. So he paid closer attention to the next battle, and noticed that the choreography had one bad guy engage the hero at a time, while the others waited their turn. Since his attention was focused on the hero and the person he was engaging, Koizumi didn't notice the others. This made the fight doable for the hero, and has also been a kung fu movie trope for decades. Z-targeting would be scripted in such a way that whichever enemy the player was targeting would be the enemy that aggroed. The other would wait his turn. Osawa noticed something completely different. During the show, one of the ninjas attacked the samurai with a kusarigama, a sickle and chain. Once again, I really hope I'm pronouncing that right, oy vey. The samurai caught it with his arm and pulled the chain taut, while the ninja still held onto the handle. The ninja now circled around the samurai while always facing him, connected by the chain. This would define the movement of Z-targeting. While not targeting, Link would move freely around. When Z-targeting, an invisible chain would connect Link to the target object. Now Link would circle around the target while always facing it, and it changed how he moved and behaved. He could now jump to the side or do backflips or do a jump attack. They had a solution to make Zelda 2's swordplay idea work in 3D. With the problem of combat and interaction in 3D space solved, the team could get into the meat of the game's design. It wasn't just Link's Awakening that gave us the Zelda dungeon formula. If it wasn't for A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening would have never iterated on that design to formalize the Zelda dungeon design philosophy. But really, it's Link's Awakening that gave the Ocarina of Time development team the format to translate 2D ideas into a 3D space. Zelda dungeons had always been about finding small keys to unlock doors, and in each dungeon there was always a special item to find to aid you on your quest. A Link to the Past added a big key that would be used to unlock the chest for the dungeon's key item. Link's Awakening switched the big key to unlock the door to the boss room. The item found in the dungeon would become a kind of key as well. The item would unlock other areas of the dungeon and was necessary in defeating the dungeon boss. Link's Awakening set in stone that dungeon formula, and Ocarina of Time ran with it. All but one dungeon required the item to unlock more of the dungeon and to defeat the dungeon boss. Note, the Shadow Temple did not require the hover boots to defeat Bongo Bongo. They actually got you killed if you had them equipped. Instead, you needed the Lens of Truth, which you got from the bottom of the well, a mini dungeon you completed in order to reach the Shadow Temple. The team did have a hefty challenge, interpreting Zelda design from 2D into 3D. Keep in mind that Zelda dungeon design philosophy, as we know it, had only been used in 2 of the 4 Zelda games made thus far. Fortunately, the developers had already approached the 2D Zelda games as 3D spaces portrayed in a 2-dimensional medium. Link's Awakening did a fantastic job of that with Eagle's Tower, and The Link to the Past had elements of that in the Tower of Hera. So translating the puzzle ideas and unlocking key design idea wasn't going to be that difficult. Creating easy to navigate dungeons and puzzles in the 3D realm?
That's something else.
Dungeons, for the most part, had large, memorable central rooms that the player would continuously cross through. This would act as an anchor for navigating each level. They started off simple. The first 3 dungeons as Child Link have no small keys, so thus have no locked doors. The Deku Tree, the Dodongo Cavern, and Jabu Jabu's Belly act as introductions to how Zelda dungeons will work in 3D. And the Deku Tree is the perfect tutorial dungeon. It's separated into 2 phases. Phase 1 was the trunk of the tree, a wide open room with multiple levels with rooms jetting off into dead ends, kind of like a hub with spokes sticking off it. It's a memorable space you can use to always reorient yourself. In those spoked off rooms, you solve simple puzzles to get the slingshot and compass, and then once you gain the items, you use the height of the trunk to fall through the spiderweb to reach the second phase of the dungeon. Once again, you're in a large, memorable room. But this is not a hub and spoke. There's only one accessible door. This path brings you around in a circle to a higher ledge back in the main room where you can push down the rock to create a shortcut, and then you use a Deku stick to light the spider web to fall down another hole to face the boss. You're facing off against enemies and solving puzzles along the way, but most puzzles don't expand past one room. It's a lovely introductory dungeon. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. You're learning the game's design and puzzle language bit by bit. The dungeons expand from there. The Dongo's Cavern has you crisscrossing back and forth across the main room on different levels, but is once again separated into two distinct sections, outside the statue mouth and inside the statue mouth. Jabu Jabu's belly gets a bit more complicated. This dungeon requires you to have the map design in your head so you can fall down these sinkholes to get to different platforms below to access different areas of the dungeon. They're asking you to see how one room interacts with another, and how changing something in one room can change the layout or accessibility of another. This dungeon isn't separated into two phases like the last two. This one becomes more interconnected. These dungeons ask even more of you in the adult timeline. Some are more interconnected, with the maps folding in on themselves and changing their form. Like these winding corridors change the gravity of the following room in the Forest Temple. The Fire Temple has you navigating a complex labyrinth to knock a block from the top to fall to the bottom, creating a path to the boss. And then there's the Water Temple and its water level. People have thoughts on the Water Temple. I personally really like it. Having to change the water level around, constantly reconfiguring the whole temple was interesting, and I felt really accomplished when I finally untangled that knot when I was 12 years old. It's Zelda 64's menu design that slows this dungeon down to a crawl. That's the frustrating part. Not the dungeon design itself, but the archaic menu design of the 90s. What is odd is the fact that the Water Temple is the apex of complexity for puzzles. In the late game, dungeons become more linear, challenge-based gauntlets with some pretty simple puzzle designs. I'm not going to delve much further into the dungeon design because Mark Brown from Game Maker's Toolkit does a much better job discussing Zelda dungeon designs in his Boss Key series. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. I would highly recommend watching his video. If the team constructing Ocarina of Time took great inspiration from Link's Awakening, most of that was applied to the dungeons and items. The Overworld is a different beast. Link's Awakening slowly opened up the Overworld, kind of like a Metroidvania map. Ocarina of Time's Overworld isn't like that at all. There are a couple of areas that require an item to reach, like bombs to get to Zora's Domain, or the long shot or Epona to get to the Gerudo Desert, but most of the map is blocked off by adventure game style mechanics. Link's Awakening's contributions to Ocarina of Time's Overworld are the fishing pond, the trading sequence, and that guardian owl. Ocarina took more inspiration from Link to the Past, and a little from The Legend of Zelda. The Overworld is filled with secret holes, kooky characters, and random fetch quests in order to progress in the game. A lot like A Link to the Past, but more obtuse in some ways. All the tropes established in the first couple games are here, and some are brought back. The Lost Woods is no longer a creepy atmosphere, but once again, a maze. Kakariko Village is your place of respite with some fun characters to meet, and Death Mountain is a treacherous climb. The difference between A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time's Overworld, though, is the layout. Link to the Past layout was a little more fluid. Ocarina of Time's map is more individualized and connected by a singular location. Let's talk about Hyrule Field. Instead of having an interlocking world, each area is a spoke off a wheel that is connected by Hyrule Field. You have Kakariko Village and the castle town to the north, you have Gerudo Desert and Lake Hylia to the west, and to the southeast you have the Kokiri Forest. There are shortcuts to quickly go from one end of the map to the other, but to get to any location, you'll be crossing through Hyrule Field a lot. A modern critique of Hyrule Field is that it is empty with very little to do. And that complaint is actually just a fact. There aren't really any cool secrets to find, no cool weapon or secret item that amazes. There isn't a secret dungeon or anything really of interest. There's a pea hat, a giant overly difficult to kill pea hat, that's something. Oh, and ghosts. Let's take a look at the real purpose of this field. It's more than just a way to connect the different parts of Hyrule together. It's supposed to invoke a feeling that the 2D games just couldn't. Zelda gave a large expansive world to explore, and A Link to the Past gave more depth and detail to flesh that out. But in Ocarina of Time, the first moment you walk into the field after leaving the forest, you get an idea of the scope and breadth of this world. It's massive, for 1998 at least. Hyrule Field, with its lack of content, still brought a lot of life. It's here in the field you can see the castle and Death Mountain in the distance, a large ranch in the center, the foothills to the mountains that lead to the desert, and the day-night cycle is introduced here. The first time you travel across the field after leaving the Kokiri Forest to get to Castle Town, you more than likely won't arrive to the gates until after dark. You have to wait for the sun to rise in order to enter. It takes you a full day. It just felt big that way. And when you enter other areas, based on the time of day, different events and different characters would be available. This area made Hyrule feel like a real large space. The point of this field is to do what Zelda had originally set out to do. Give you that wide-eyed stare as you begin your journey across the kingdom. It was to feel large and epic. This was a sprawling, living, breathing kingdom, and you are going to save it. While it may seem tiny and uninteresting today, it set the foundation for overworld design in the third dimension. Super Mario 64 required a pretty radical redefining of the Mario experience in order to be playable in the 3D space. Also, the team ran out of time during development and had to get something out in time for the Nintendo 64's launch, so that's also a factor. Zelda, on the other hand, had an easier time translating what worked in 2D into 3D. The design philosophies, boiled down to their absolute basics, work well with the new medium. In addition to that, Ocarina of Time was a triumph of design. Without it, who knows where current game design would be? It made third-person action combat intuitive in the 3D space. What GoldenEye did for FPS games on consoles, Ocarina of Time set the design standard for action-adventure and pretty much any other third-person based action game. And moreover, it's still a very playable and enjoyable game today. Not something that can be said of a lot of 3D games from this era. Oh, there are some chinks in the armor. While some would argue it's the Water Temple, I would say it's the Overworld quest design. They're reminiscent of the obtuse fetch quest / adventure puzzle solving of 90s video games. Let's take a look at how you open Dodongo's Cavern, the game's second dungeon. You have to first go to Hyrule Castle, find a sleeping Talon, get an egg from Marin, wait a day for the egg to hatch, use the Cucco to wake Talon, move the boxes, go through a stealth section, talk to Zelda to get her letter, talk to Impa to learn Zelda's lullaby, use the letter to get to Death Mountain, play the lullaby to get to Darunia in the Goron City. But he's a mood, nothing's cheering him up. How do you cheer him up? Go back to the Kokiri Forest, follow the music through the Lost Woods, find Saria, learn her song, go back to Darunia and Death Mountain, play Saria's song, cheer him up, he gives you the Goron arm brace, now you can lift up bomb plants, and finally throw in over this specific edge to open up Dodongo's Cavern. It's a lot. It took the fetch quest that A Link to the Past used and turned it up to 11. Don't know if that's a good thing. This is part of the reason why we have Navi, which her name is just short for navigation. She would chime in, whether you wanted her to or not, to let you know, hey, maybe you should try this. I think the only Zelda companion more disliked than Navi has to be, oh, what's her face? Fi, or is it Fi? Whatever, the sword chick in Skyward Sword. It's the only one that I can think of that people hate more than Navi. Each dungeon does have a quest to open the dungeon. A few even have mini dungeons to complete to open that main dungeon, like the Ice Cavern to get the Iron Boots to get to the Water Temple, and the Bottom of the Well to get the Lens of Truth to open the Shadow Temple. And also with the Shadow Temple, for some reason you just have to have Din's Fire. Like, hopefully you found that if you were just exploring, and nowhere else is it needed. Despite some of these idiosyncrasies of the past, Ocarina of Time is still a very enjoyable game to play to this day. When I talked about Super Mario 64, I mentioned you had to approach that title with the attitude of, this is great for the time it was made. You have to view that game through the lens that it's one of the first, and for being one of the first, it got more right than it did wrong. Ocarina of Time, I don't think really needs that lens. It stands very well on its own 2 feet to this day, even if those 2 feet are firmly planted on the shoulders of giants. And not just the giants of previous 2D Zelda games, but also Mario 64. I mean, Koizumi came straight to Zelda after working on Mario, and he was very aware of the former shortcomings and knew what they would be able to iterate on, not just to make Zelda a good game, but how to make a good 3D game, period. Ocarina of Time is not just great for its time, it's still great today. And while it may stand on the shoulders of giants that came before it, it became a giant of its own and laid the foundation that just about any other 3D action-adventure game would be built upon. No game is made in a vacuum.